All right, good evening. It's just a little after 6 and time for us to get started. We are going to look mostly tonight at chapters 10 through 29-ish, a little bit maybe even through 31 of the book of Proverbs. There will be maybe some references to the first 9 or so chapters. You remember the other night that when we were outlining the book of Proverbs, that really I think you see this as you read the book, and I think this is helpful in trying to get a grasp on the book of Proverbs if you're going to read it, is that the first 9 chapters are kind of an introduction to the book as a whole. Basically, an appeal for why you should listen to the book. And basically, it's making the argument for pursuing wisdom, the value of wisdom, where real wisdom comes from, where folly comes from. So mostly it's a father kind of passing down this wisdom to a son, which is I have no reason to dismiss the idea that it's not actually Solomon speaking down to his son, but it takes on a broader application than that. And then also you have a wisdom figure presented as making the appeal for following wisdom, the way that wisdom works in the universe and how we can apply ourselves to that. And then also on that same kind of like way of thinking is you have Lady Folly kind of presenting her path, and maybe if you even compare that to the adulteress, is kind of presented there. So you got 1 through 9 that kind of lays out this comparison between wisdom and folly. And then really chapter 10 to the end of the book are basically applications of wisdom and examples of folly in just about every area of life that you can imagine. Just across the whole spectrum of things that we encounter and engage in. And I think that you know that after having heard Proverbs or seen them or read them from time to time. So as we were thinking about how to put this together, basically our idea tonight is to kind of narrow that down to a couple of themes. We'll talk about some kind of like foundational principles that I think are helpful. But basically, I think we're going to try to talk about like work and money a little bit together, and then talk about family, so marriage and children a little bit together. I don't even know if we'll have time to get through all of that. It may just be like stored up for a sermon down the road or something like that. But that's kind of the idea, and I think it is at least to focus it in those ways, I think is helpful for us to kind of, basically, I just want to see how the Proverbs work. So let me say a couple of other things before we go down that road. The first thing is that when we look at the Proverbs, I think for the most part we have general truths. You fear God, you act wisely, things in life will go really well, will go great. And I think we see that. I think we see that people who exercise their lives wisely and are careful in the steps they take and are aware of how their words affect them and how they're aware of how they spend their money and they're aware of how they choose their spouse and all of those things. We watch these people and we say, yes, those people seem to have a blessed encounter with life. And on the other side, you don't have any fear of God, you don't have any wisdom, things are going to go poorly. And I think we see that too. I think we see people who make bad sexual decisions. I think we see people make just foolish, greedy money decisions that is end up melting them down. And maybe they learn from that and they develop wisdom in after that. But you say, okay, they've not walked in keeping with what Proverbs would say would be wise, which would be work hard and save and think about the future and all these sorts of things. But those are general truths, right? They're not, in some ways, they're not promises in the sense that every time you fear God and act wisely, things just go great. That you don't have any issues, that you don't have any financial problems, that you don't have any marriage problems, that you don't have whatever. So just think about one passage with me. Well, we'll think about two, but Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 27. Proverbs 10 and 27. The fear of Yahweh, fear of the Lord, prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. I mean, it's a general truth, I think. I think that's probably right, that people who have the kind of life where they fear the Lord keeps them from doing crazy, get yourself killed quick kind of things. But there are people who I've known, who I've considered to make really wise, godly choices. And their life is short for all sorts of reasons, right? There are accidents that happen. There are sicknesses that occur. They step into a bad situation that they didn't realize they were stepping into, whatever it might be, and that their life is short. And there are wicked people who just keep on hanging around, right? And you say, so 1027, I think, is a passage where you can look and you can say, this is a general truth, but it's not like a prophecy. It's not like an exact pronouncement of how things go. I think we think about Proverbs 22:6 a lot. This is one of the most famous of these, and we've talked about this a little bit last time, I think. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So there's all sorts of questions about a passage like this, right? How do we know when we've trained up a child according to the way, and when he's old, he's departed from it? What's going on? So, I think there are some reasonable responses. And it's like one of them is, you're not a perfect parent, no matter what you did. Like nobody's perfect. So there is a way in which you would say, there is room for this to be kind of an absolute truth in some ways, right? Like if you train up a child in the way he should go, then he won't depart from it. Well, none of us are perfect at that. So there's plenty of room for error. The translation that I'm actually using says train up a child according to his way, which is basically the idea of like picking up his, his abilities and his personality and all that, and kind of try to use all of that to direct him in that way. I don't know if that's the correct translation or not. Okay, go ahead. Just go ahead. No, that's okay. Yeah.
The way I take it is, even though that Solomon and all wrote this was all inspired by God.
Right.
And I think that what God's conveying in these scriptures is that if a parent trains up his child about the right and the wrong things and to obey God, and also trains them to stay away from evil. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times people actually train their children through their courses of life, but the child takes it upon himself to be around bad influences, which in turn, by staying around the ones that's doing evil things, even though they were taught right, but they didn't listen to what their father or their mother said, and they chose. It wasn't the parents' choice. It was the child's choice to do evil, where I don't think that you can take that what it says that it ends up another way. I think that if the children, or even the parents, you can take a parent that lives righteous, and then he gets around the wrong crowd and starts meddling with stuff that he don't need to be meddling with. And next thing, he's worse than the sinners that he's been telling not to be like. Yeah. But it's not because of the teaching, it's the choices that you make, whether it's a child or a parent.
Yeah, so I think that's helpful to think about. So we would say that faithful parenting, focused parenting is a key dynamic, right? That it's a major factor in children growing up faithful, right? I'll tell you, I've been in places, and like I was in a meeting somewhere this year, and I met some people, and I met them, and they are just, I feel like in every way I know, they're golden. And they have children that are not just like not faithful. I mean, just a mess. And you say, what happened? Well, I didn't know there were a lot of stories about 50 years ago. I didn't know those stories. I didn't know that situation. They were actually the ones to share those stories and kind of talking about what had happened, kind of like, I didn't ask, like, hey, what happened? They just kind of said, and it's like, oh, okay, right? So we can see people develop wisdom. That's not where they were a long time ago, right? That's not where they were when their children were in the house or whatever. But I think we would say this is a general principle. This is what we see as a factor. We know people who are faithful people through their life who I think cultivate faithful children, but we also understand that this is not something where we just say every single time where you've got good, faithful parents, those children just do exactly right. My grandfather and grandmother, I think we're great people. I think we're very devoted parents. They have 3 out of 4 children that have been just along the way. And then there's one there's been more issues, right? And when I say issues, you don't want me to talk about it. But it's like you say, well, what happened? Were they not doing what they were supposed to? Well, I think they were trying. I think they were trying to train up the child in the way that they should go. But when they were old, like a long time after they were out of the house and things went crazy, and then she points back to the raising and said, this is what it was. And it's like, that happened when that's a long way back. Anyway, so I don't mean that. I'm just trying to point out a general truth about the Proverbs because it can be frustrating sometimes when you read the Proverbs and you're like, well, this doesn't happen all the time. No, but generally it's true. Yes, sir, Mr. Ray.
It says if you bring a child up in the nature of the law of God, teach him what right and wrong.
Yeah.
He might fall away, but he'll come back.
Yes. Yes. And that may still happen. That's exactly right.
I've heard it explained that if we raise a child like it should be, that he may not follow it or she may not follow it, but they wouldn't forget it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you can do certain things to write it on their hearts, and that's a general truth as well. That's right. Okay, so one thing that you might think about in line with this, just as something to add to it, is that this is right with Job and Ecclesiastes. And I think what you see in the book of Proverbs kind of gives us the picture, I think I made mention of this last time, is that Proverbs kind of gives the picture of the wise man's going to just make it just fine, right? So it's going to roll right through. And Job especially gives us the picture that the wise man's going to suffer for maybe a range of reasons, maybe reasons. I don't know that Job ever gets any explanation that we get in chapters 1 and 2, right? About Satan and all of that process. And so maybe you could kind of think of Job as, yes, the book of Proverbs is true, but let's dive down deeper here in this idea of the success of the wise. I think the book of Ecclesiastes maybe is in some ways helpful to that. Do you have anything you want to add to all of that?
No, it just the fact that it's general truths. Mm-hmm. Like you can't treat it like you treat the rest of the Bible, I think has kind of hurt my view on things growing up. And like y'all mentioned, you've got these parents and their kids are not faithful, and you just, well, right there it says if you train them up in the way that they should go, that when they are old they won't depart from it. And when I was younger, I questioned, well, what did they do wrong? Were they not as strict as they should have been? Were they not as faithful as they should have been? Were they not excited about worshiping the Lord? And when I've got to know these people better, they did. They were excited for the Lord. They were strict. They were all the things that you should be as a parent, but the child chose to do whatever. And some of these other things that we're going to talk about, it's a choice in there as well. And I think trying to apply the rest of Scripture to Proverbs doesn't work. But at the same time, we should still take the wisdom that's there and try to apply it the best that we can.
That's right. I think we should see it as God ordained truth.
Yes.
And so I don't want to take away too much from it. And so maybe that's, sometimes we're trying to balance this out because we say, well, look at this huge mistake I made, or look at my situation and it's not going like that. And we almost take away from what God's word says. I want the balance to fall, and I want us to see that the balance falls in that direction, because of course it does.
And to what he was saying, or along with what he was saying, sometimes I've heard parents say, well, I had them at church every time. And that's a mistake, to think, because it's not the church's job to raise your children. It's like a help, or it's God's plan. I know that
it's necessary, but it's not total.
And it's great. You got them at church every time, I think, but I don't think, anyway, that's not, and I think most parents would say, I know that they're not saying that's all we ever did, but I'm just saying, that's not enough.
No, I think that's great. And if we have time, and I don't know that we will, but if we do, then like this idea of thinking about what it takes to raise a child is so consuming, right? It's so life orienting that's important to think about.
Can I make a quick point?
Yes, please do. No, it's okay, no worries.
So with the idea of these general truths, I think sometimes we get so focused on the results that maybe we're not focused on the process. So I'm probably going to mess this up, but Nick Saban talks a lot about the process. He's like, if you're focused on the results, then you're going to be disappointed more times than not, right? You don't just win a championship every year. But if you're focused on the process, a lot of times results follow from that. I think that's what these Proverbs are getting to is if you focus on the process, there are certain results that follow from that more often than not. Doesn't guarantee every time, but I think that's what we should take away from it is there's a process in which we should follow. Let's do that.
I think that's very good. So let me illustrate this just briefly. And maybe I mentioned this last time, but Job's friends who come to him, they have quotes that you can find in the Proverbs, right, about the consequences and what they have concluded must have happened in the lead up to that, right? And so they are taking these general truths and applying them to this guy and saying, you must have sinned horribly because God has said only sinning like, a rebel would get you to this place. We can reverse proverbialize like that, right? So what we can do is we can come to the consequences of a situation and kind of read the conclusion backwards, and that's dangerous to do. And so, we can think about ways. Job calls them proverbs of ashes, and I think that's what they are. It's not that the principle is not true. It's that sometimes the specific application, only looking at the conclusion without thinking about the actions that led to it, is not helpful. What we want to do is look at the actions that God says is required. That's what I think. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. Is that's the action that we're trying to look at. This is what God calls us to, and trust that He says this is the way that I can guide it and help it to turn out. It doesn't always, because people have free will choice, but this is the basic truth, and not just looking at the consequences and saying, well, if somebody's in a good financial situation, then they must be a righteous person. That's reverse proverbializing, right? That's a proverb of ashes. So would like somebody being in financial, just terrible situation. There might be all sorts of reasons for that. Wisdom and godliness might not be the reason. So we just need to think about that carefully. Okay, one more thing as far as introduction. We're not even going to have time to get through themes because I'm doing so much introduction. But I'm saying all this to say a whole bunch of other stuff. But I was reading, one has suggested that maybe these Proverbs are split into two smaller groups. And I think this might be reasonable. That chapters 10 through 15 are very stark, black and white, contrasting, really just, this is the way the world is. And that the end of chapter 15, beginning of 16, and following is a little bit more comparative. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's just turn to chapter 10 for a second. Chapter 10, and I'm going to start at verse 3. I'll just read you a few in chapter 10, maybe a couple in chapter 11, and I'll let you assume that this is how it keeps going. Chapter 10 and verse 3. The Lord will not allow the soul of the righteous to hunger, but He will push away the craving of the wicked. I know that there are people who are righteous who are hungering right now. Now they don't all live in first world America, right? But there are more Christians in places like Ghana and Zimbabwe than there probably are here in America, and there are famines there every year. So, yes, general principle that wise people are able to manage things better, but this is a very stark principle here. Look at verse 9. He who walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his way crooked will be found out. Verse 30. The righteous will never be shaken, but the wicked will not dwell in the land. 11 verse 3. The integrity of the upright will lead them, but the crookedness of the treacherous will destroy them. One more, verse 21. Assuredly the evil man will not go unpunished, but the seed of the righteous will escape. You see how clear and stark those contrasts are? Always going to be okay for the righteous, never going to be okay for the wicked. Always good for the good, always bad for the bad. Very stark. And so you can carry that all the way through chapter 15. But then, look at let's go to the end of 15 to start with. And I'm not trying to just like manage everything and or I'd say just dictate everything. So if you have something you want to say, please do. But look at chapter 15 and verse 16. Look, notice the difference here. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord or Yahweh than great treasure with turmoil with it. All right, so you see how that's different than the passages in the previous one where it's just like a very stark. This is just like, well, if you've got to choose, you'd rather have better than a lot if you've got the fear of the Lord with the little and turmoil with the bunch. Right? Now, and that could be said in a stark, clear way too, right? It is absolutely essential that if you're going to have anything, you got to have the fear of the Lord. That's the key thing. And that having everything with not the fear of the Lord is a complete mess. Maybe this is a little like, maybe it's just not as boldly stated. Look at verse 70. Better is a dish of vegetables where there is love than a fattened ox and hatred in it. So it's just a comparison that's just showing us the difference away. 16:8. Better is a little with righteousness than great produce with injustice. Verse 16. How much better is it to acquire wisdom than fine gold, and to acquire understanding, and to acquire understanding is to be chosen above silver. One more, verse 19. It is better to be humble in spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Just looking at that comparison and seeing the differences, maybe in 10 through 15, where it's just like bad and good in the world versus some comparisons in the way we might choose to live our lives. Is that helpful? See any of that? You might could keep looking at it all the way through. I have references all the way through 28 on that, but we won't look at all those. All right. You got anything else before we jump into the
One
things?
question about on 10.
Yes, sir.
I know we kind of looked at famished by other countries being hungry,
Yeah.
but I think the scripture ain't talking about food for the body because, Jesus actually says that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God.
Yeah.
I think that the righteous, even though you may not have food and you're hungry, but if you're actually studying God's word, you'll never be famished because the word of God is actually stronger than all the food that you can ever have on your table to eat.
Yeah. So I think there's a great principle at work there that you're getting to, which is that there are there are spiritual principles, and thank you for bringing that up. There are spiritual principles that are at work here that even when the physical things aren't working out, that we say, well, we can point to a spiritual picture that is better. I do think that there is a kind of wisdom principle about literal bread in some extent. So I think about like what David says, that he's never seen the seed forsaken or begging bread. I don't know that he's talking about only spiritual bread. I think he's talking about the provision that God makes. But I like what Jesus says in Matthew 6, verse 30, seek first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all these things, food and clothing, will be added to. Right? He's specifically referencing food and clothing. I'm not saying that means there are not times where we won't literally be starved or unclothed and persecuted and all that. I'm just saying, I think in general, in kind of day-to-day care provisions, I think God basically promises to take care of that, that he'll carry us through. But I certainly, I'm not trying to dismiss what you said at all. I want to just kind of add to that. But I think it's very true that ultimately, even when we read those passages about the righteousness remaining in the land and the wicked being cut off, and we say, well, I see maybe there's a persecuted place and righteous are being cut off all the time, and wicked are allowed to remain. What would you say about that? Well, the righteousness are the ones that are really righteous, are the ones who are really remaining. The wicked are the ones who are really being cut off, even if they're the ones who are allowed to survive. So I think that's absolutely true about that spiritual principle. Now, I will say in that 16 and following passage, there are a real clear distinctions as well. There are passages that are just super in principle, and so you can see things like that. We don't have to look at those right now, but that's okay. All right. Any questions, comments, thoughts about anything so far? Any passage that you want to throw out there that you think is a helpful way of thinking about all this? Be happy to hear from anybody. All right. Did you have a preference for which one to start with? Did you want to start with family?
Oh, yeah, we can.
Okay, so we're going to start with family, and Alan's been talking so much, so I'm going to take control of all of it. I'm just kidding. No, we're going to talk about family, and basically what I want to do is talk a little bit about marriage as much as we, for a minute, and then maybe talk a little bit about teaching. So first of all, when you look at the Proverbs, it refers to marriage as a blessing. So look at Proverbs 18 and 22. Why don't we do this? Why didn't somebody read that for us? 18:22, and then somebody get us 19:14.
He who finds a wife, this is
18:22. That's right.
He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord.
Very good. And 19:14.
House and wealth are inherited from father, but a prudent wife is from the Lord.
Very good. So what do these passages present about the idea of marriage, especially of a husband looking at a wife? What's the point here? A gift from God. Very good thing, right? So it obtains favor from the Lord, that in comparison to an inheritance that you might get from a dad, that here is somebody who comes from the Lord. I like that picture. Here's a gift. That word there in 19:14, that insight, yours might say some other word. Does yours say a different word in 19:14? Did you say it there? Yeah. Discern, prudent. Does anybody say discernment there? I thought there was one that said discern. Maybe do what now? Sensible. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so there's lots of different words that somebody who looks down the road, somebody who uses wisdom in kind of seeing the outcomes of decisions. Here's a gift from Yahweh, and you can do more study on that word and it'd be worth doing. But I think that is a great picture that's being presented here as a choice of a godly man choosing a godly woman. That's a blessed marriage. That's a good thing. That's something you want to be pursuing. Do you have something on that same idea or anything like that?
Well, just really 12:4, it says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who causes shame is rottenness to his bones. So there's that contrast there. And, the passage we looked at, it's really good.
That's right.
But it can be the opposite of that. But like Larson said, I think those other passages are talking about the way God designed it. You have a godly woman and a godly man. It is a very good thing.
Yeah. So I think that's a great point. So that not all marriages are a blessing. Well, where does that come from? Well, we can talk more about that in just a second. But maybe we would see some of those characteristics in the opposite. I think basically the picture that we should kind of have in our mind is the Proverbs 31 woman. The opposite kind of woman is the one who falls in the second half of 12:4, right? So there is this picture of a blessed marriage that God would have put together, and then there is a picture of another one. So 11:22. So here is what kind of woman should a man be looking for? This says, as a ring of gold is in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who turns away from discretion. Maybe this was the passage I was thinking about, discretion, making choices and things like that. But think about that. The phrase, a beautiful ring in a pig's snout, or a swine's snout. The point here is here's a young man, Solomon says, is thinking about, choosing this woman, and she's beautiful. Great. Check. Right? She lacks discretion. Right? Doesn't make good choices. Doesn't discern well between good things and bad things, wise things and unwise things. So what kind of choice is that? Well, here's the thing. She may be a beautiful woman, but she's like a gold ring, which is ideal, but she's in a pig's snout. Right? So it's like packaged in a way you don't want it. Right? That the packaging is not the body. Right? The packaging is the demeanor, is the character, and that's going to ruin it, right? It's going to mess it up real bad. So you think about that, like what she's looking for, and what you there are not as many passages in Proverbs about what a woman is looking for in a man. I think probably because it wasn't driven as much by women in this period of time, but there is a lot of discussion about wisdom in seeing a man that is wise or a fool. And so I think we could give a checklist for women today to go through and say, okay, how do you know if your man's a fool? And we may talk about that Wednesday night. Maybe that's our plan. So that's
a man's world, so everything's
that's right. And it's kind of passed down from father to son. Like, this is how you look at the world. I don't think it's unreasonable for a woman to be looking at a man in almost a very similar way, right? Like, he's really funny, but he lacks discretion. It's like, well, that's about like a gold ring in a pig's snout, whatever. Okay. What do you think? Anything on that? Okay.
I didn't have anything else.
Okay.
So.
Well, we won't be able to talk about it, but I think Proverbs 31 is super great. And since we're in the middle of this discussion, I think this would be a reasonable time to talk about it. I don't think, I really don't even think we have time to talk about all of it. It is interesting to me that this is an acrostic set of Proverbs. So every verse from 10 to 31, each verse starts off with the next letter of the alphabet. So like, it's not A-B, but it's A-B, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daleth, all the way down. So it was very thoughtful and kind of like laid out. So here's this model virtuous woman. And I think if you read through this, I think the kind of characteristics you would see in her is she's trustworthy. You can trust her word. She is hardworking, for sure. She's making provisions for down the road, right? So she's like sensible and prudent. That we talked about that one wife, like looking beyond just today. She's characterized by mercy and compassion. She is valued and praised by her family, who she values and takes care of. So I would say that maybe fundamentally when we come to Proverbs 31, I think for women, I think this is a passage we come to and we say this is a great place to look as kind of maybe just kind of I don't know, maybe a simple list of things to look at. For men, maybe a list of things to look for. But I wonder if it's even more than that. I wonder if it's a picture of kind of what everybody ought to be trying to be, because this woman seems to be the Proverbs altogether, right? Her words are trustworthy, her character is hardworking, her senses are looking down the road to the future, she trusts in God, she takes care of her family. It seems like such a beautiful picture of and so think about this. For the first 9 chapters, you have Lady Wisdom calling out, come this way. Look at how this would work. But it's very, abstract, right? It's just kind of like, wisdom's good. This is the means by which God created the world. This is the kind of flow that you want to get into. And then at the very end of the book, we have a picture of a real Lady Wisdom, right? Of Lady Wisdom living it out and saying, I'm walking down Lady Wisdom's way, and this is what it looks like. And everybody's like, oh, okay. We can kind of fall into that and merge into that. And so certainly there are certain aspects of it, I think, that would be decisively like in the lane of women. But the way it's written is a way to say, think about the ways that this would apply. And it's interesting that actually these are the words of King Lemuel, whose mother taught him about this, which perhaps initially was, this is what you ought to be looking for, or something like that, as this instruction was given. So that's basically anything that I have to say about marriage. I think there are lots of passages that say that there are not good situations, and a contentious woman might make a man live in the corner of a house or in a wilderness. Like it would be better not to live in the house, and so just be aware of that. And so
my favorite one.
Oh, good.
Is Proverbs 27:15.
Yes.
So a continual dripping on a rainy day and quarrelsome wife far away.
Yes. There you go. There you go. Yeah. I hate repetitive noises, so I'm sure I would be bothered by that too. Yeah. Luckily, my wife doesn't fall into that. Okay. All right. Let me think for just a moment about the blessing of parenthood. How about that? So this is Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 24. And you may have other things you would like to say about this. 23. Look at verse 24. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begets a wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her rejoice who gave birth to you. There's a comparable passage actually over in Psalm 127. I realize it's not a proverb, but it's kind of a wisdom psalm in some ways. And the psalmist there, it's actually of Solomon, which is interesting. In verse 3, Solomon says, "Behold, children are an inheritance of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with enemies in the gate." So I love this picture of children being a blessing that's granted. I'm not sure that the whole world thinks of children as a blessing that's granted. And I'm afraid I don't all the time. I'm afraid I'm like, man, this is a lot going on, right? Or this is, but I think that thinking about this fundamentally as arrows in the hands of a warrior, I love that phrase. I've talked to my boys about it. They don't understand what I'm talking about yet. I hope they'll learn it eventually. But chapter 23 of Proverbs 24, this idea of having a wise son that you can watch operate and how glad and grateful that makes you. I think that is a beautiful blessing that's being pictured here. And so what you have in order to get to that is you have this call of parents to teach, discipline in one way. And the word discipline in our minds is almost always correction, which shows up in the book of Proverbs. But then there's like teaching. Did you have any passages you were thinking one way or the other that you wanted to?
Most of them are more along the lines of correction.
Yeah. Which there's actually quite a lot.
Yeah.
And like I'm not opposed of covering that. If I'm talking about the book of Proverbs, I'm not opposed to coming to that quite a lot, because Solomon makes the point to his probably nearly or grown son, hey, this is an all right path forward. So
I think since we're already in 23, 13 and 14 are very helpful.
Yeah.
Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. And that kind of tells us why we're doing the correction. We're trying to deliver him from hell. Yeah. And I think something helpful to think about with a child, especially as a Christian, is even if you take trying to teach them righteousness, just take that away. And if you can't stand to be around your child, no one else is going to be able to either. And so as far as that goes in society, then it's going to be the same way. If you can't stand to be around them, no one else is going to either. So you have to teach them how to be. And so that you can take that further and take it into righteousness. If you know that they're not doing what they should, then you have to teach them what they should be doing and make them do that. And so if you being a Christian, I can't stand to be around him because he never wants to do what's right, then other Christians are going to treat him the same way eventually, if he will not change after he's been talked to and talked to and talked to. So that's why the rod comes into place. There has to be that fear and that respect for authority. And us being as parents, we are the first line that they ever come in contact with of authority. And how they meet you is how they're going to later put that on the authority of the government and the authority of God. And so we have a big role to carry in that. And I think that's why there's so many passages in Proverbs about discipline, is because you have to use that to teach them, because they don't understand it 2 and 3 years old, but they're a terror, or can be a terror at 2 and 3 years old. And so even though they don't understand, you have to use that rod. I know you don't understand, but this is the way it's going to be. And so I think that's very helpful. And I know there are many of us in here that are either wide open going through that or fixing to be going through that. And so that's something that to keep in your mind, that they are the first, you are their first authority figure that they come in contact with.
Yeah, so you got kind of two parts of that. You've got the discipline in some ways that comes first, right? This is the training that's coming. I may talk a bit more about that in just a second, if that's okay. And then you've got the correction that kind of happens on the backside. And I like 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, right? That's what Proverbs is about anyway. That's what we're trying to instill. But a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. So what we're trying to do is we're going to try to pass down the wisdom that we have from one generation down to the next, which I think Proverbs is basically that. Anyway, here's the wisdom that God has delivered. Proverbs is passing it down to us. We want to take it and pass it down to our children. The rod and reproof are part of that. But on the front side of it is that discipline thing. So this is actually in chapter 3, but I'm only pointing it out here because it seems very connected. This is actually about the discipline that comes from the Lord. But I like the connection that's made in another place, and you'll know this because of what it mentions here. Proverbs 3, verse 11. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof. So you have two things going here. The discipline, which I think is like the initial training, like when he's trying to disciple you, when he's trying to train you in the way that he would want you to go. For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father reproves the son in whom he delights. It may be discipline, it may be reproofs. Anyway, so does anybody know, or maybe have a cross-reference right there close? Where is that quoted in the New Testament? Remember? You'll remember it as soon as I say it. Do you remember the passage in Hebrews 12 that says, do not forget the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons? This is Proverbs 3 quoted in Hebrews 12. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, and he disciplines, and he flogs every son whom he receives. So basically, he says, all of us had discipline. We didn't enjoy it when we went through it as a child, but God, we're being disciplined by him now. And I don't think the idea is that these Christians are being punished. I think they're being trained in the right way going forward. I love that quote in Proverbs. Don't be mad at the tenuous trials that the Lord leads you through, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to make you wise. He's trying to make you like him. He's trying to make us like Jesus. And that trial path requires going through discipline and, from time to time, reproof and correction and things like that. And that's compared to the path of a parent. And I think that's a very helpful comparison and way to think about all of that. Any other passages you want to look at?
And I mean, you could just, playing off what you said about how God disciplines us, 13:24 says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. And then over in 19:18, it talks about chasten your son while there is still hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. And I know there's been many people say that we have a window to kind of deal with these things, and that kind of sets the course. And we talked that like that's a general truth. They still have free will to choose whatever, but there's still hope while they're children. And I would even say there's still hope as long as they're living, that we shouldn't give up on that. And just the promptness of it. When you see there's a problem, and sometimes you've worked a long day, you come in and this is happening, or it's been happening all day, and your wife's been trying to deal with it, or your husband's trying to deal with it, you've been gone and you can deal with it better. You have to jump in there and deal with it then. You can't put it off when you see a problem, because those things only grow. And we don't know what that one problem that we didn't deal with will turn into something else. And that goes for physical or spiritual things. And so as soon as we see something, we need to address it and we need to deal with it.
Anybody else, they have anything they want to throw in about marriage or about children, or any proverb that they would like to point out that we didn't get to?
I'd like to say you need to be careful with this disciplining your children now.
Yeah.
Children are going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Now, that don't mean beat them for making mistakes.
Right.
Outright rebellion, that's different.
Yeah.
Breaking the rules, that's different.
Yes.
But mistakes, you need to be careful, because you can provoke them to wrath.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there was a proverb, and I didn't write it down because I should have, but there is one about being concerned, and that's what's driving this, right? It's concern, right? We can get out of the way and just be a bully about it. So that's an important principle. Yeah.
I heard a gospel preacher one time talking about the difference between cowboy mentality and shepherd mentality.
Yeah.
Cowboy, trying to corral, trying to drive the stock.
Yeah.
Whereas a shepherd is trying to lead.
Yeah.
You go back to that Proverbs 22:6.
Yeah.
It uses that word train. And the idea behind that is you're the parents, and with the children, you're training those children. In other words, you're the engine of this training. They are the car behind you, so you're leading them
That's
in
right.
the right path. You're not trying to drive them, corral them,
Yeah.
but you're actually leading them.
That's
so
great.
You're teaching them, but you also the example.
That's
You're
good.
seeing.
Yeah, so Proverbs 20, verse 7 says, a righteous man who walks in his integrity, how blessed are his sons after him. So it's almost like he's headed, and here are his sons following. They're blessed because they're able to follow in his steps. So that's a really helpful way of thinking about that. So that's super. Okay, so let's think about this. Wednesday night, what about our plan B? We'll try to talk about work and money for a period of time. If we run out of the amount of stuff, Proverbs has a lot to say about it, so I think we'll be fine. But we'll try to do that, and if we run out of time, we'll talk about like how to spot a fool. A lot of this stuff that I got from Wes Brown, who came with us for a meeting. I've had some things going on, and so I was like, I need somebody to kind of help me with some stuff to put together. And he kind of sent me some of the stuff. I've obviously gone through a lot of it, but anyway, I think we'll talk about work and money, and then maybe a little bit of like a picture of foolishness, kind of in general, in the book of Proverbs, if we have time for that. So, thank you very much for your participation tonight.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.